morning, everybody. My name is Gad Barzilai, previously the Dean of the Faculty of Law, PI in Minerva, and now the Vice Provost of the University of Haifa. And I have the pleasure and the honor, obviously, to launch and to open and to make a few comments at the outset of our what seems to be a very exciting event, which was organized by 3 research centers. Let me maybe begin with the end of my short comments. And so this is a Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions, which was established 6 years ago, managed by Professor Eli Zaltberger, my friend from the Faculty of Law, with several PIs, Professor Deborah Shmueli from Geography, Professor Amnon Reichman, who is now at UC Berkeley for sabbatical. We are joined by Professor Itamar Mann from the Faculty of Law. The directing executive manager is Dr. Michal Ben-Gal. Secondly, the Center for Cyber Law and Policy. Thanks very much to Yoni. It is headed by Professor Niva Elkin-Koren and Professor Tal Zharsky from the Faculty of Law. And thirdly, the Oktovitzer Center, headed by Professor Ronen Perry, and the center deals with law insurance and the issues of risks. So it's a pleasure to be here. Our guest speaker would be Admiral retired Ami Ayalon, and I will introduce you later on to Ami. Let me maybe at the beginning just a few snapshot comments about democratic challenges in counterterrorism or counterterrorism and challenges for democracy. So firstly, you know, it looks as a quite straightforward, conventional topic. But actually, if we look seriously into the issue of democratic challenges in counterterrorism, it's much more compound and complex than it might be seems. So firstly, what is national security? For example, in American academia, at least while I was teaching, it became more obsolete to talk about national security. It became much more prevalent to talk about human security, about social issues, human rights issues, democratic challenges, which are part of the overall package of national security. So what is national security? We may have contentions about it, not only, by the way, in the context of specific countries, but also at the conceptual level. Secondly, what is a democracy? So often, for example, my students who do a mistake talking about democracy and a liberal democracy interchangeably, but it's not necessarily the same. There are countries which are democracies, but not necessarily a liberal democracy or liberal democracies. A mentor of mine at Yale, Robert Dahl, used to talk about polyarchies, not about democracies, namely about majoritarian system which have a lot of deficiencies. So what is a democracy? What are the distinctions between having a democracy and having a liberal democracy might be another issue that we would like to talk about. And then obviously, what is terrorism? Do we have one objective definition of terrorism? Might be yes, might be no, as we all know, in the context of political conflicts and asymmetric conflicts, like in the case of Israel, who is a terrorist would be by itself a matter of definition. Only yesterday, following the cancellation of the visit of the Argentinian soccer team, national team, our Secretary of Culture defined it as a terrorist act. So, you know, it's this is obviously only an anecdote to a much in-depth issue of how we define terrorism. And terrorism would be a very empowering notion to allow democracies to use all kinds of methods which may impinge on human rights and may impinge on citizen rights, and often judicial review would not be a good response. Let me give you only one example. So lately, we completed a huge data set about the Israeli Supreme Court. In cases of national security, the probability of an appeal to be upheld by the Supreme Court would be 3 times less than in any other topic on which an appellant will make a case in the Supreme Court, which means that the Israeli Supreme Court is adjudicating not a few appeals regarding national security, more than many other courts in other democracies. They are adjudicating most issues concerning with national security, which would be appealed to the Supreme Court, but they don't intervene. Very rarely they are intervening. So actually, the Israeli Supreme Court would have a legitimizing effect on the status quo regarding the military occupation of 1967 and regarding issues of national security. There are some exceptions. One exception was dealt by Ami Ayalon when he was the head of the Shin Bet, the Israeli Internal Security Service, and this was the famous case by the Israeli Supreme Court regarding tortures, when the Israeli Supreme Court decided that several methods of investigation allegedly used by the Shin Bet are illegal and unconstitutional. Did it have any ramification and repercussion? Might be that Ami will talk about it later on. Secondly, the Israeli Supreme Court dealt with the issue of extrajudicial killings, which is very rare in comparative law to see a Supreme Court dealing with an issue of extrajudicial killing. They didn't do much. They redefined issues of procedures. Is it important or not important? This is an issue, obviously, for debate. And last and not least, the major challenge for democracy, how you make security services dealing with terrorism and counterterrorism, how do you make those organizations transparent and accountable? And the law would not necessarily say much. In fact, often the law would not say much about it. Is a Supreme Court going to intervene? In comparative law, often not. Certainly also not in the Israeli case. So who is going to make sure that those organizations acting under the veil of secrecy would also be, at least somewhat to a certain degree, accountable and transparent? Before we move ahead, I would like also to congratulate our guests from overseas, our friends and partners in Minerva from University of Hamburg in Germany. I would like to thank the Faculty of Law and the Minerva Center, which is a university center, for organizing this event, and Professor Eli Salzberger, who came for a week from his sabbatical for 48 hours from Munich. So it's a pleasure to introduce you Admiral retired Ami Ayalon. Ami has an academic background. He's a graduate of Harvard, of Bar-Ilan University. He was the chief commander of the Israeli Navy. Prior to that, he was a commander of the Sea Lions, which in Hebrew we call Shayetet 13. It's a kind of a translation. He has a ministerial background. He was a minister. He was a leader in the Labour Party. He was a leader of an extra-parliamentary social movement jointly gathered by Israelis and Palestinians. And he also was the chair of the managing board of University of Haifa, so he knows how I feel today when I have to rush between 10 different meetings. So it's a pleasure to have Ami with us.
And he was the head of the GCA.
And the head of the Shin Bet of the Internal Security Cell that I mentioned prior.
He will torture you if you will not mention.
Well, today it is forbidden since September 99, right? Okay. Thank you, Gadi. You have said it all already, so let me add a few remarks. First of all, you mentioned the sea lions. Seals is sea, air, land. It has nothing to do with a sea lion. So first, it's in Israel, it's a naval commando anyhow. And second, when Eli called me from Germany and asked me to speak, I asked myself, what am I going to say to a group of lawyers? Since my background when it comes to legal issues are not very professional, so I decided that under the assumption that most of you are with a legal background, the way I understand this session, at least from my point of view, is that you understand terror and the war on terror through the lens of legal or law, and I understand legal issues and law through the lens of terror and how should we fight terror. It's a different point of view, bring me to some different conclusions. And what I'm going to try to do is not to give answers, I don't have many answers, but to shake a little bit some of the assumptions, some of the paradigms, that the way I understand my friends from the legal department, I have many of them, by the way, today in the Israeli Democracy Institute and even before in the Israeli Shin Bet, is to shake a little bit some of the paradigms that looks to be very stable, to my view, too stable. So when Aaron Barak said it was for us in September 99 that democracy is fighting terrorism with one hand tied and still winning, it was a concept. At least the way we understood it. And the question that I think we have to ask today is whether it is still a viable concept. Second, especially when we see recent events in Gaza or in some other places in the world. And second, when he is saying still winning, what does it mean of victory? How do we know that we are really winning? Because for Barak, it was a kind of assumption. It was not the result of an analysis. So what I would like to deal with is, first of all, to claim that the war that we are fighting today, we call it war on terror, is a new kind of war, and to try to explain some of the characteristics of this war. And before I start, the insight that I will try to present are the result of a 2-year research process that we have done, by the way, with one of the members was Eli Bahar. During 2 years, a group of people trying to understand the challenge that democracies are facing today when we are fighting terror. So the question, again in the background, that I think should be asked or discussed is whether the paradigm of defensive democracy is relevant to the war of terror or on terror today. What do we mean when we use the term defensive democracy? Again, not as a lawyer. For me, it is a kind of a simple concept based on the idea that democracy is not a recipe for suicide. I think that, again, it was mentioned by Aaron Barak. And the question when we are trying to deal with the concept is to what extent human rights are restraining for security. So we have two values. One hand, human rights, especially in liberal democracies. On the other hand, security. And the assumption is that security and human rights and human life overcomes human dignity. If you ask me, this is the way I understand when Gadi mentioned the rulings of our supreme law and the fact that he does not intervene is under the assumption, listen, we are dealing with security here. Security is a very big issue. Human life should overcome human rights. This is the way, again, it's not a legal analysis. This is the way I understand the reality in Israel today. It was the right assumption in the old wars. What do I mean when I say the old wars? Old wars were with a limit of time. We know exactly when the war started, and we should know when the war is end. Sometimes it took 6 days, sometimes it took 5 years, but it was a very specific time frame. Second, the strategy in order to achieve victory, to win the war, was based on a military decision for the last almost 200 years. Third characteristic, so the assumption was that if we shall achieve a military decision in the battlefield, peace or a better reality, political reality, will come later. It will be dictated by the winning side. When I say a better political reality is for the one who won the war. Third, it was a kind of a total war. Everything, economy, culture, human rights, everything was almost enslaved for the victory, in order to achieve victory. And the assumption was that on the day after we shall achieve our victory, we shall go back to hold our core values. Meaning, we shall give back rights to those that we took from them during the war in order to win the war. In America, during the Second World War, I understand that they locked thousands of Japanese that were American citizens, paid taxes, probably some of the children served in the American military forces. But it was okay to do it. Why? Because they were perceived as potential enemy. And in order to achieve war, security, potential enemy should be locked. This was a price, but it was clear that after the war, they will get back their rights. Now, the question whether this concept is still valid should be analyzed through the lens of what is the new war? What is the war on terror the way we understand it? I want to deal with 7 characteristics of the war, but I will start with von Clausewitz, who wrote something very interesting. Clausewitz used to distinguish between the nature of war and the conduct or the character of war. He used to say the nature of war will never be changed. It is a human behavior. Humankind, people killed in the past, are killing in the present, and will go on killing for power, for resources, for money, for many reasons, as long as they will be human. But the conduct of war, the character of war, is changing as a result of revolutions in technology and in culture. Now, if we try to understand, for example, this was the way to explain, for example, the dramatic change of the conduct of war, the character of war between the Second World War, which were a decisive war, meaning the strategy of military decision, unconditional surrender, and the Cold War that lasted 40 years, but was a war. It was a result of nuclear technology and the changes. It was the era of rights, human rights, minority rights during the 60s, 50s, and liberal democracies. So it is very, very important to understand it because it gives us some tools to try to understand the reality of today. What were the two major revolutions that created the new world during the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century? Without going into details, it was mainly the two revolutions of globalization and information technology, meaning communication, information, media, internet, all these kind of technologies under the umbrella of information technology. These two revolutions created a world of transparency and diversity. I have no time, and I am not an expert to explain all the nuances of this new world, but I can tell you that the result of transparency and diversity we are facing today in the beginning of the 21st century, a new kind of economy. Most of the paradigms of the economy, capitalism, or any kind of economy of the 20th century are shaken. A new policy, a new political concepts of democracy, and a new kind of war. I'm going to discuss, of course, the new war, which is the result of these two revolutions. Now, the seven characteristics, the first characteristic is transparency. When I say transparency, it starts with a simple assumption that every image, every picture, which is taken in the battlefield, in the checkpoint, is transmitted in real time into the internet space, which is the world. Real time and every picture. I mean, when I say every picture, so there is no government intervention between the event, the image, and what the spectator see in real time everywhere. There are participants. Some of them are going to the battlefield in order to kill. Some of them are going to the battlefield in order to die. We saw it in the Turkish flotilla. We see it in Gaza. Many of the people who are going today to the battlefield, they are going to die knowing that they will achieve some achievement, not if they will kill, if they will die. and it is part of the question. What are they trying to achieve? And there are spectators. The spectators today, they are very active. First of all, they see it in real time. Second, in the war of today, they have a huge amount of power to influence, because the division of political power in this new world is totally different. All the administrations, all the governments became or lost power, and the power is somewhere in the street. People in the street does not know exactly what to do with it. But when we say that every leader, not only in democracies, even in Russia, is reading polls, we are not laughing. He is reading polls in order to know what he should say, because in a way he has to get legitimacy every morning. So it is like a reality show. We call it, by the way, in the professional field, the theater of terror. It is a kind of a theater. Actors who are participating and spectators who are participating exactly, or at least are trying to influence. When I say they try to influence, first of all, almost immediately, they decide who is the good and who is the bad in this reality show. So once they took this decision, usually they are human beings, and we explained to the world that the weak is the good. David and Goliath. In the Western world, almost everybody knows this story. We know nothing about Goliath, by the way. Probably he was a great guy. But he's a bad guy. Right, okay, but he's a bad guy in the story. So once we decide who is the good and who is the bad, we behave accordingly. We elect our leaders in Europe, in South America, depend on the way we understand the picture relating to a Middle Eastern conflict. We decide what product we should buy, what to buy and what not to buy. It is not a decision of governments anymore. It is a decision of people when they come to buy a product. Probably it is the best product of the high-tech industry. He will decide, he might decide not to buy it because it was produced by an evil person or an evil group of people. So when we try to understand the reality in many parts of the world, but my view is an Israeli view. By the way, the camera becomes a major and a dominant factor in this war. I don't know if you saw the movie. They were competing against us. In the gatekeepers, 5 broken cameras. Both of us, we lost and they lost. The Oscar, of course. But why did we have to break 5 cameras? Because the camera is becoming, in a way, a major factor. When I say major factor, camera has unintentional characteristics. They weaken the strong and they empower the weak. When we say asymmetrical war, it is a wrong concept. By the way, the concept that we are using today is hybrid, which is much more relevant and not asymmetrical, When we say asymmetrical, who is the weak and who is the strong in this changing kind of scenario? The second characteristic, it will be shorter, is diversity. War is no longer between states. It is much more between a state and an organization. But more important, it is a kind of war between cultures, sometimes religions. The book that was written during the 90s, Professor Huntington, is becoming very relevant. So the war, when he said clashes between civilizations, there is an element of civilizations and religion concepts. It is very, very important because when we study the art of war, we understand that there is a very high correlation between culture and strategy. The Chinese strategy was never identical to the Western strategy because the influence of tradition, religion, and culture on strategy is dominant. And when we say diversity, it is two different kinds of strategy. I'm saying it because as a result of the influence of culture on strategy, we understand that today what we see is the confrontation of a strategy of military decision with a strategy of non-surrender. And I will deal with this issue in a moment. The third characteristic is the absence of military decision. In the war of today, there is no military decision. No one is surrendered, even when he is defeated on the battlefield. No one will raise a white flag. And there is no image of victory anymore. We understand it when we are trying to understand the behavior of the Israeli and the Palestinian side. We fought in defensive shield more than 50 days. We killed more than 2,100 Palestinians. But they did not raise a white flag. They did not surrender. They were beaten on the battlefield, on the civilian, or on the military front, but paradoxically, they became more powerful in the public opinion, Palestinian public opinion. The support in Hamas among Palestinians when defensive shield started was between 25 to 27%. 1 week after this relatively long operation or war, it raised to 56% among the Palestinians, because the concept of we are leading the mukawama, which is the opposition, the violent opposition to the enemy, was a major concept in the Palestinian public opinion. So, since we understand that the, in a way, kind of battle between Hamas and Fatah within the Palestinian society is on the support of the Palestinian people. So in the eyes of Hamas, Hamas won this war. it was clear to them that they lost, they were defeated in the military front, but they couldn't care less about the military front. This was not the front that they really tried to win. In a way, the strategy should be discussed because we have to understand what happens when the strategy of military decision meet opposing strategy, which is not a military decision, like in the Second World War, but non-surrender. When we were kids, we used to play Even Yao Isparayim. How do you say it? It's
rock, paper, scissors.
How?
Rock, paper, scissors.
Okay, rock, paper, scissors. When the rock meets the paper, who wins? Paper. I can tell you from my own experience that the rock is very frustrated. The rock is sure that she is much stronger, much harder, and the rock cannot understand why the hell is she losing. This is exactly what happens when military decisions meet non-surrender. We have to understand that non-surrender wins every day when is not defeated. So as long as a non-surrender does not raise a white flag, he is winning in his eyes and in the eyes of the public around him. The time frame, major importance. Again, in the old wars, it was a very, very specific time frame, but in the war of today, it is more a kind of an ongoing process of never-ending kind of conflict, violent conflict. There is no beginning. We don't remember exactly when it started. Some people will tell you that we started our war against terror when the first Zionist immigrants came during the late 19th century. Some will tell you that it started. We don't remember exactly when and how it started, and we don't know when it will end. Probably it will not be Hamas. Once there were the Arabs, Fedayun. Second was the nationalist movement, Fatah. Today it is Hamas, but we know that after Hamas, we shall meet Al-Qaeda or ISIS. We don't know the names, but it is not going to disappear. We don't know when it will end. We don't know how the day after will look like. If we shall win, we don't know whether we won or not. By the way, Dan Shomron, who was our General Chief of Staff during the first Intifada, with a great intuition, he told our cabinet ministers and that used to believe in power. Rabin at that time, the Ministry of Defense, gave him an order to break arms or whatever, to break using power. This was the way we understood this order. With a great intuition, Dan Shomron said, and not many people liked it at the time, that it is not a military phenomena, and the military organization cannot win this phenomena. As he said, all what we can do is to reduce the level of violence, to reduce the level of flames, and to give the opportunity to political leaders to try to come up with a kind of agreement or solution. Again, it is not a military phenomenon. I'm saying it because from the legal point of view, it raises a question. When we say that it is not a military phenomena, whether the law of war is relevant or probably it is more a kind of a law enforcement and we should use the criminal law. So it is a question, I don't have the tools to discuss it, but the way we understand it today, at least in our team, it is more and more like a crime. Nobody thinks that crime can be eliminated. We have to live with the enemy. We have to live with some level of violence and to see whether we can reduce the level of violence in order for us to go on living, creating education system, science, research, and a good way of life. The fifth characteristics, Gadi mentioned it, terror is not one entity. When we say terror is a terror, it is stupid. Everyone who deals with terror understands that terror organizations are different in goals and means. At least in the Middle East, what we see today, some terror organizations are using terror, using illegitimate kind of violence, killing or targeting civilians in order to create a state. They will define the character of the state. But in a way, what they want, what they wish, is to create a state, meaning to join the international community. They do not want to destroy the world order. On the other hand, some organizations are trying to destroy the world order and to create a new kind of system, a caliphate or any other. They oppose the world order, which is based on a nation state as a cornerstone. It is very, very important to understand that there are differences between ideologies, even within the Islam itself, and there are differences in strategies. And there are huge differences in the way they deal when they decide to go to fight. The level of violence and cruelty is totally different. So just to sum up, Al-Qaeda is not ISIS, ISIS is not the Islamic Jihad, and Hamas is not Hezbollah. I'm saying it because we have to adopt a strategy against a very specific enemy. There is no one strategy to win terror. We have to understand that we have to choose and to design a strategy specifically in order to win or to fight against a specific terror organization. It was Sun Tzu who said that when we fight, we are fighting the enemy strategy, not the enemy himself. Meaning, by the way, it is amazing, in the old wars, we invested a huge amount of time in order to study our opponents. There are stories of American generals who read biographies and papers that were published by German generals in order to try to understand what is behind the person. How does he think? I can tell you, and including myself, because I was a member of our military and security community until I came to the Israeli Shin Bet. I never thought that I have to read something that was written by any terrorist leader. I never read the speeches he used to speak, he did not write, of Sheikh Yassin or of Nasrallah. And they are presenting their strategy in a very clear way. We generals, we don't really care. The sixth, the war on terror is passing from the military front to the home front and to the international front. We are fighting in parallel in three fronts. I'm saying it because when we study the terror, the concept of terror, we understand that for a terror organization, the battlefield is not the main front. The home front, the civil society, is the target. When we read the speech of Nasrallah in Binge Bail in 2006, when he compared the Israeli society to a cobweb of the spider, he means that the Israeli society, the home front, is a weak point of the state of Israel. And it is the same when we try to understand the speeches of Sheikh Yassin in 1998, when he say, Israel, at least the way he said, they are stupid. They think that if they possess a nuclear power, they are going to win this war. They do not understand that in this war, the one side that will achieve victory is the side with the faith, belief, and with the understanding of the time frame, the way they understand. They understand that winning is not something that we achieve today. So again, he is trying to explain that the military front is not the major front. And the last parameter, the war on terror create a huge impact on us, especially as a liberal democracy, and in a way shaping or changing our core values as a democracy. When we try to understand how terror influence on us as a society, there is a concept of the double effect of fear. We understand that the idea of the terror is to create fear. This is all what they are trying to achieve. They know that they do not have the power to conquer the state of Israel. They know that they do not have the power to win the battlefield, but they target the society. And all what they want is to create fear. If they create fear, they are winning. Now, what we should do if we want to fight terror is to do everything in order to reduce the level of fear among people. We do the opposite in America, in Europe, and in Israel. Why we are increasing the level of fear among our people. We have to recruit them in order to fight. It is a war. Now, if we shall tell them, look, it's not a fearful phenomenon. We are losing people, or the will of the people, to go and to fight. We have to create a budget that gives priority to military issues and to security organizations. So we need it in order to manage this conflict. But there is something else. We understand the power of fear in order to be elected. We have to understand that in the transparent world of today, leaders are not elected every 4 or 5 years. They are elected every day. They know it, by the way. And they understand the power of fear. By the way, it is very, very easy to prove it. There is a research was made in IDC that show that the closer are the elections, we see more and more in our daily newspapers specific terms: Hamas, Hezbollah, terror, Iran, security, etc., etc. As the closer the elections, closer the security issue, and without or with intention, we are increasing the level of fear. Now the result, when we meet a fearful society, we shall always, always prefer security on rights. By the way, today is a demand of the street. The street is demanding to take rights, civil rights, human rights, minority rights. Now, what we see is that minority is perceived more and more as a potential enemy, by the way, in the streets, but in the courts as well, and everybody who will try to analyze the rulings of the courts in Israel will agree to the idea that we see it in the behavior of our courts, and the result is deepening divisions between minority and majority up to the level of internal violence. What we saw in the end of the summer of 2000 is the beginning of the Second Intifada. Violence between Jews and Arabs in Israel. If we shall not change the course of our actions, we shall see it in the future. We shall meet violence not only against Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. It will be in the home front. Because in this case, democracies do not lose in the battlefield. Democracies, if they will lose, they will collapse inside or inward. It will not happen in one day, by the way. A friend of mine in Rand, Santa Monica, he wrote 15 years ago a great article, very short, 5-7 pages, Incremental Tyranny. And he is dealing exactly, he does not use the term defensive democracy. He is saying in the war of today, he said it during the 90s, every day we give up a small and proportional amount of liberties. It is a very small one. But it is an ongoing process. It is a never-ending conflict. So one day, I don't know when, we shall wake up, we shall look around us, and we shall say, once we had a democracy. We don't know exactly when we lost it, but it is sure that we don't have it today. So in a way, in a continuing reality of war on terror, the path or the way leads to George Orwell's 1984. And the legal system, and you said it in the beginning, the legal system gives the process a stamp of legitimacy every day. So just to close my remarks, we live in a new world and we fight another type of war, a new war. In the new reality, we have created all paradigms must be tested, examined, including the defensive democracy that justifies a proportional but continuing infringement of rights. I'm optimistic, by the way. I'm optimistic because we knew how to do it in the past. When I say we, is humankind. When Reagan said, when he was a president, that nuclear war cannot be won and therefore it should never be fought. It was a way to describe the huge change from the old wars to the new war that at that time was a Cold War. So the transition from the military decision or unconditional surrender of the Second World War to mutual deterrence is a proof, during the Cold War, is a proof that it is in our hands or in our minds or in our power. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ami. We have about 5 to 10 minutes for roundtable discussions. So who is going first? So maybe I have one comment or one question. So you talked about the Israel Institute debate where you came to the conclusion that a terrorist event or a terrorist act is a crime. It would be defined in criminal law as a crime. And my question is...
We said that it should be looked not only through the lens of law of war.
Okay, but as a crime. So my question, if one defines an act of terror as crime, now especially in the Israeli context of the 1967 occupation, it may mean that actually we are routinizing or normalizing the 1967 occupation. Is it, how do you see it?
I have no, I cannot give you an answer in legal terms. I'm not a lawyer. We have an ongoing debate within the IDI, and I believe that it should be a debate. I'm afraid that in the Supreme Court, they don't really care about it. I don't blame them. They are lawyers, and I don't think that they have the tools to deal with this problem. In a way, I know that President Barak will not agree with me. The way that I understand the Supreme Court decisions, they are legitimizing the occupation. This is a way, because when they deal with the occupation, they say, okay, it is a temporary when they deal, no, when they deal with the settlements, as they say, it is a temporary, and it will be resolved in a political or between political leaders. But so they don't deal with it in a way. The question should be asked: what will happen if today somebody will demand a resolution on how many years a phenomena can be considered temporary? I have no idea. On the other hand, they deal with the daily life, and they create a notion that a human behavior, etc., etc. So for me, it is not a legal issue. For me, if we shall win this war, from the military point of view, our border will be on the Jordan, and Israel will not be a Jewish democracy. That's it.
Eli? Let me, Ami, thank you for your very interesting remarks, but let me play the devil's advocate. Terror of today, or the kind of terror, is undermining liberal democracy, right? On the one hand, for a political scientist who looks at historical and comparative perspectives, the fact that this kind of terror exists in our region for 100 years did not succeed so far in, well, succeeded in deteriorating our liberal democracy, but not the destruction of the liberal democracy. On the other hand, when you see worldwide countries which do not have any terror, which do not have any problem of immigrants, and there is deterioration of the liberal democracy there, Poland, Hungary, you know, there are no refugees in Poland, there are no minorities in Poland, there are no terror acts in Poland, and we see there a whole deterioration of liberal democracy. So I'm not sure if the connection between the intensity of terror activities and the success of liberal democracy is really there. The period which Israel, I think, had the worst period of terror was the exploding buses 20 years ago. It's not the Gaza fence now. And this was, in a sense, a period in which the liberal democracy did not deteriorate as it is deteriorating now in Israel. Mm-hmm. So maybe this connection, again, from historical and analytical perspective, is not proven.
No, you are trying to discuss the concept of victory. In a way, are you asking, are we losing? And you say no. But the question, are we winning? And the answer is no. So in our paper, by the way, we discuss the concept of victory. And by the way, this is something that today I'm writing my paper.
Victory means for you the maintenance of liberal democratic values?
Exactly. It is an ongoing, a daily, we have to win every day or we lose every day. So every morning we have to fight in order to keep our liberal democracies, our liberal values, and in this way, law enforcement and criminal law is much better. Because the concept that we cannot beat, we cannot eliminate, we have to live with the enemy. And the concept of victory, we use to describe victory dealing with the enemy. For us today, it is a huge mistake because victory is a better reality for us. So we have to measure victory, how close we are to the concept of the Declaration of Independence. In a way, I think that this is the only paper that I'm not sure that will be agreed today in Israel, but the closest common denominator in the Israeli society. And what I'm telling that if we shall not change our concept, we are getting far and far from this concept.
You know, it's interesting because Isaiah Berlin used this very, very interesting metaphor of the bending tree, okay, which is not exactly what you described. What is a bending tree? That you press it, there are no change until it, at one point, hits back. So if this is the case,
no, this is not my case.
yeah, this is not your case.
Because
if
he described one day it will, no.
Right, you know, something that is under pressure all the time,
Right.
the reaction is not constantly similar or consequential,
Yes.
but at one point it breaks.
Right.
And this is not your description.
No, my description, the title of Brian Jenkins, when during the 90s, he said incremental tyranny. This is the way we understand the process. We shall not know exactly when it happened. In retrospect, we shall understand. If you see Israel today, if you see, and I'm sure that you see the laws that are discussed in our parliament, you see it a gradual process, day by day. This is a major threat to a liberal democracy.
Please.
Two questions regarding what's going on now in Gaza. First of all, do you think that the Palestinian struggle today is a terror or it's a legitimate war? Second question, do you think that who is winning in this war until this war?
First of all, to the second war, if you ask me, all of us are losing, Palestinians and us. No one is winning. But again, what is the concept of victory? We do not discuss it now. The definition of terror, by the way, there are more than 100 definitions. But there is a common denominator that every use of violence against civilians and civilian targets in order to achieve political goals is terror. So Palestinians they are terrorists. There is another question, whether there is some legitimacy. This is something that the legal system finds it very, very, if you will move to the criminal point of view. So in the criminal law, you will find some explanation, because an act of violence, when you hit somebody, the only question not whether you hit or not. You can ask, what did he do before I hit him? Probably he did something that brought me to use violence. But in the international law of war, there is a very clear Chinese wall between the cause of going to war and what is allowed and what is not allowed during the war. In the criminal law, it is different. So again, we did not come with a solution. But what we are saying is that we should look for some different concept.
Maybe the Palestinians were asking to our act of maybe terror.
The time frame.
Yes, we are left with a few minutes. Over.
Well, I mean, in many respects, Israel is a special case. If I apply your insights on countries in Europe, for instance, Germany or France, then the question is, would you say that the constitutional establishment of a clear distinction between a state of exception as a situation in which human rights certainly can be restricted much more than in other cases. The distinction between state of exception and state of normalcy.
Sorry, between? Okay.
Normal constitutional protection of human rights. If this distinction, if the erection of such a distinction, defended also by a working constitutional court, would that change your analysis of the incremental loss of liberty? Because also Europe, of course, is under the threat of terrorism. It's not just Israel, but also Europe, but in a different way. So the question is, could that help? Could that at least alleviate the situation which you described?
In a way, but by the way, we gave a name since we don't think that it is exactly war the way we understand the concept of war. I think that the title, the name that we gave to this phenomena was an ongoing hybrid conflict with a variable level of intensity. Sometimes a low intensity, but it is an ongoing process. I'm saying it that you said that Israel is a specific case, yes. But there are many commonalities between what we see in Europe and what we see in Israel. First of all, you have to understand, and I'm sure that you understand it much better than I do, Europe is changing. Europe of today is not Europe, I don't know, of the 80s and the 70s. First of all, the demography is totally different. Now, when we analyze the concept of globalization, there is a term, the new phase of globalization. Waves of immigrants started, by the way, not as a result of the violence in the Middle East. It started as an economic phenomenon. Hundreds of millions. I think that the number is between 400 or 500 million are living today in states. They are citizens of states in which they were not born. So, in a way, it is the first wave of immigrants. And I'm not mentioning all these dozens of millions who has no, they are not civilians. They don't have any passport. They are illegitimate. They do not have any right to have rights. I'm mentioning only those who we know in the figures. Now, most of them, more than 90% of them, they came to what we call Western democracies. Europe, Canada, America. Now the demography of Europe is changing. Now it is not a new phenomenon. Waves of immigrants, it was something that we saw during all history. But it is a new world. During the history, immigrants, when they came to the host country, the assumption was that in 2-3 generations, they will accept the culture, the language, the food, sometimes even the religion of the host country. Today, it is totally different. They do not want to give up on their origin, culture, religion, food, or the way they dress. Now, in addition, clashes between...
Is this a war?
No, not yet, not yet. Wait. It is a beginning. It is a process. It is a gradual process. I'm trying to explain the way I understand Europe. Now, it is a threat to the identity. which is very, very important. Right? In Israel, when we read on events in France or in Switzerland, in a referendum, they decided that no mosque will be higher than a church. Well, it is a great joke, but it was a decision of the people. So there is some... Sorry?
No minaret. No minaret.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, of course, okay. So I'm saying it because what is it? It is the beginning of a sense of fear. The dress in Paris. It is a threat. Why it is a threat? Because it goes together with events. Right? A minority which is from the religious point of view, cultural point of view, sometimes use the same language as the enemy who is far away. The enemy is somewhere in the Middle East. But there is a minority in France, in Germany, in some other places. And they are becoming a potential enemy. They are identified with the enemy. They find it more and more difficult because globalization created a competition in the labor market. So rifts between people, minority and majority groups, create violence. The question when it will be terror is just a question of time. I cannot tell you that today all the events in Europe is under the definition of, I have no idea. This is not my expertise. But I can tell you that it is only a question of time when it will become terror. And it is not very different from what we see in Israel. Not totally different.
I would like to thank Ami Ayalon for an engaging and very stimulating
conversation in the first panel, and I could almost feel the hunger for conversation and discussion developing as the time ran out. I hope we can continue now. We have four very distinguished speakers that I would like to introduce. Each will take about 20 minutes to present their discussion, and then we will have time for Q&A. On my right is Major General retired Dan Efroni. And Dan Efroni is a former military advocate general of the Israeli Defense Forces. He had a rich professional military career during which he served in the IDF Intelligence Corps in professional and commanding positions, rising to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Dan's legal military career within the Military Advocate General Corps began in the mid-1990s and spanned several senior positions, including Military Advocate of the Northern Command, Deputy to the Chief Military Prosecutor, Chief Defense Counsel, Deputy to the Military Advocate General, before being appointed Military Advocate General in 2011, serving in this position until 2015. Since he retired, Dan is an associate researcher at the Cybersecurity Research Center at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. After Dan Efroni, we will hear Advocate Eli Bechar from the Israel Democracy Institute. Eli Bechar served for many years in various positions at the Israeli Security Agency, better known in Israel as the Shabak. His last position from 2006 to 2011 was the ISA's head legal advisor and in charge of the ISA's legal division. He's an active lawyer, teaching at the Tel Aviv University, and also a researcher at the Israeli Democracy Institute. Mr. Bachal holds a BA in Economics and Political Science, an LLB from Tel Aviv University, and a Master's in Public Administration from Harvard University. Then we have Nadav Berman-Schiffman from the Philosophy Department and Judaic Studies at Yale University, who is a postgraduate associate at where he is a postgraduate associate. His areas of research are Jewish thought, American pragmatism, and humanist perspectives on new technologies. His PhD dissertation, which is currently under judgment, good luck, and I'm sure it'll pass with flying colors, at the Department of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, is advised by Professor Avinom Rosnick in researching philosophical connections between Jewish thought and classical American pragmatism. Interesting. And then lastly, we have my colleague here, Dr. Eldar Haber, who is also at the Center for Cyber Law and Policy, among the organizers of this event. Dr. Haber is an associate professor or senior lecturer at our Faculty of Law, and a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. He's also a member of the Haifa Center for Law and Technology, and as I said, the Center for Cyber Law and Policy. His main research interests consist of various facets of law and technology, including cyber law, intellectual property law, privacy, civil rights and liberties, and criminal law. His works were published in various flagship law reviews worldwide, including top specialized law and technology journals of US universities such as Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. Over the years, he has won several academic awards, including the International Association for Privacy Professionals Award for Best Privacy Paper Award in 2017 in Europe. His works are frequently presented in various workshops and conferences around the globe, and were cited in, not only in academic papers, but also in governmental reports, the media, and US federal courts, which I learned from this bio, and is quite impressive. We will go in the order that I presented the speakers. And as I said, around 20 minutes, I'll be the time policeman, and after that we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Okay, you are going to be the policeman of the time, so I just skip to the last of my final slide, because I'm not sure that I will not in 20 minutes. I'm going to speak, and not focusing on cyber terrorism, I'm going to speak about cyber warfare. That will bring it's not my definition, the definition to this term, which including, of course, the cyber terrorism as one nuance. And, but I first of all want to bring you all to the context of the material of cyberspace, then move on to the gap that we have between the technology and the law. I'll describe very shortly the attempt, or the main attempts to fill that gap, and will present again very shortly, if I have the time, several cyber warfare operations that we researched recently, and I think that the most important are the conclusions about the legal challenges that are now in the current, so-called the current law, and we'll finalize with the thoughts about what would be the next stage. So the main characteristics in very short comparison between the cyberspace and the others, the main and important to our discussion is the cyber. We don't have borders. You can act. It's also in full anonymity, and it's still non-regulated. Cyber warfare, this is a simple definition, initiated and sponsored by nations, which involve the employment of cyber capabilities to achieve the nation's objective political, of course, in or through cyberspace. The main categories of this warfare: destructive or disruptive cyber operations, influence cyber operations, cyber espionage. By the way, all of them are well familiar, well known from the traditional warfare. And cyber terrorism and cyber crime, it's, as I mentioned before, nuanced because they use the same system, computer system, to achieve their goals, and the motivation is make the difference between those systems. A small funny cartoon about the evolution of warrior. It's simplify the differences relating only to the weapon. But what is hidden is the evolution of law. The hacker in the front actually still doesn't have the law. The other, it took times, but have been regulated. We know we have. I don't know. Hopefully that you didn't have the impression of the first keynote that we are acting without law. No, there is a law, but still in this realm of cyber, the law, and when I'm saying law, it's also the domestic law and international law. I will focus on the international law, but I think that every nation has to find a way to legislate to enable their authorities or military or security services to succeed in fighting terror. The threat, almost anyone may be connected to anyone, anytime and anywhere. It also, not anyone, everything. We are in the IoT, everything is connected. All these characteristics are being used certainly by militaries and, of course, terror organizations and criminals as well. What is very sad fact is that while we are developing the system or the cyberspace, having many things that beneficial to to mankind, little concern is being given to risks and vulnerabilities, and much less to regulation. All, as I mentioned before, can be exploited and or attacked in seconds from remote location overseas. I brought here for Ami, but he's not here, a citation of his counterpart from the American Navy. But he said in 2009, no flotilla of ships or intercontinental missiles or standing armies can defend against such remote attacks located not only well beyond our borders, but beyond physical space in the digital ether of cyberspace. So what is the law that applied or should be applied in cyber warfare? I mentioned national law and international law. It's very complicated, or much more complicated to reach to international law than in the domestic field. So the attempts started in 1999 with the UN resolutions on establishing United Nations group of governmental experts. It's sadly saying ended or reached its deadlock 2017 because the international community is totally divided between two blocks, West and the East, and every side wants to take it to his side, and it was ended in June 2017. And other attempts kind of academic attempt initiated by NATO in 2009 due to two significant incidents. I would not get into details, but just mention it. Estonia in 2007 and Georgia in 2008, both involved unique cyber operation used by Russia to achieve political and military goals. That brought NATO to think about this topic and impose the mission on a group of experts headed by Professor Schmidt, Michael Schmidt, who is a well-known expert in the laws of armed conflict. And they ended the first mission, or they didn't know then that they would have to complete the mission, but they started 2009, ended it in 2012, and the first Tallinn manual was issued in February 2013, focusing on all the incidents that above the threshold of use of force. But what is use of force? What is the threshold? And the answer was given: a cyber operation constitutes a use of force or armed attack when its scale and effects are comparable to non-cyber operations rising to the level of use of force. Very simple. Just look what happened in the kinetic, make the comparison. This is the use of force. It sounds simple, but it isn't so. The second, when it published in 2013, in very short period, they understood they missed the point, and because till 2013, I don't think that that we can identify even maybe only one incident that is considered to be above the threshold of use of force. I refer to the Stuxnet, but even the Stuxnet, within the group of experts, it wasn't unanimously supported as use of force. So they have to complete the work, and they started in 2013 the next. This time they diversified the group, because the first group was dominated by Western experts, and they tried to enhance the group by bringing even an expert from China and from Japan and North America. And this time they focused on incidents that below the threshold of the use of force, and the Tallinn Manual 2.0 is giving now the full picture as it perceived by a group of experts, actually 20 experts, supported by the fact that they used more than 50 reviewers all over the world. Each reviewer got a chapter or a topic to review. And they also had a process of representatives from, I think, 50 states, process that was initiated by the Netherlands government to discuss legal topics relevant to Tallinn Manual and achieve important and significant input to include in this Tallinn Manual. But this Tallinn Manual is still not a law. It can be a source for developing the law, but it's not binding international law. And the simple fact is that we have 154 articles, but hundreds of pages of commentary. So it's a very good and very important contribution to the lawmakers in this arena, and but still is not the law. We picked 11 operations. It's not incident because there are more than 11 incidents in this table. Out of thousands of incidents since the summer of 2012, trying to figure out if the Tallinn Manual, which is the most important contribution to establishing law in the recent years, if it indeed had influence on the practice of states. And practice of state is a very important source of establishing international law when you can't reach to convention or other treaty between within the international community. I'm not going to get into all those incidents. I just mentioned that we have 5 incidents from the U.S. U.S. victim state is the U.S. We divided the states to groups according to the targeted states. So we have 5. I think that most of them are well known. The first one is DDoS attacks against banks, the financial sector in New York, actually attacking 46 very big financial institutions in New York for almost 180 days of actually crippling the business days of those institutions, causing them a lot of financial or monetary losses, and also intrusion to the remote, to the central command of a dam in New York. It could have been considered as use of force or threat in use of force, because if you can control the dam, you can be prepared to cause damage or physical damage to civilian targets. We have the Sony hack attacking the Sony Picture Studios, the OPM hack stealing more than 20 million files of American employees, and the DNC Act, the most famous one, during the presidential campaign in 2016. We got. I'll skip those slides and I'll give just the.
Show us for a moment. Show us the other events. Just, you know.
Which?
The former slides.
You can see.
The one before this?
Okay, סליחה?
The one before this one.
I'll give you just the findings. First of all, only in 4 of those incidents we add a full attribution by the victim's state, or it was the DNC and the Sony hack by the American, and WannaCry and not Petaya, it's not only by the victim, but actually it was attributed by Ukraine, the first one, almost automatic attribution, but later on it was attributed by a group of leading Western nations, the US in the front, and of course UK and others. None of those incidents was considered to be crossing the threshold of use of force. None of this. We can identify, or we identified, ambiguity of all the involved nations. Ambiguity even by not only regarding the attribution, but even when you attributed the incident, they didn't complete the work by identify which international law was breached by the country, by the attacker country. They didn't use the word use of force, non-intervention, due diligence, obligation, international obligation that were included in the Italian manual. Our conclusion that they might have done it just to keep the cards close to their chest, because we are in the stage of establishing international law, and no one of those states want to publish their political or legal stance toward a specific topic, and because they have the capabilities. The most capable states are the US, for example, like the US. I'll use it as an example, a very good example. They are the most capable country in cyber. They use this tool to achieve their goals, offensive or defensive. And by publishing now their specific stance or legal stance, might lead the law, the international law, to direction that I'm not sure that they know now what would be the right or correct direction to lead the international law. Therefore, they use this ambiguity, and I don't have a lot of time to elaborate more, but I'll end with those slides. The most important, I think, legal challenge is to bring the international community to agree upon binding law. This would enable us, or the international community, to maintain coordination and accountability as an important tool to tackle every bad thing or wrongdoing in this world. You can call it terror, crime, but all those are threats to the stability and security and human rights in our world. Tallinn manual is not sufficient. Contributed, but is not sufficient, and it described what we call lex lata. This is the current law as we understand, but we are doing in a realm that we have lex ferenda. What should be the law? And I agree that the current law is not always applicable. You can't apply it. For example, we have a lot of problematic questions about sovereignty, about due diligence. Sovereignty, for example, one of the stands that is still or beginning to be turned out by the American and 2 weeks ago by the Attorney General of the UK, saying that we don't accept sovereignty as a rule. This is a new approach. Tallinn Manual wrote it very clearly. Sovereignty is a rule. Bridging the sovereignty, if you bridge the sovereignty by cyber, and all the countries all over the world have on a daily basis bridging the sovereignties of nations. But if they accept it, if the American or if the Israelis or the British accept it, the meaning is that they are violating the law, international law. So the official stance of the Brits, of the UK, since 2 weeks ago, is that we don't accept it as a rule, but as a sovereignty, as a principle. The American didn't publish it officially, but through several officials, but not the Attorney General or someone from the leadership of this country. They support the position that sovereignty is principle but not a rule. Due diligence is also important rule in Tallinn Manual, but have never accepted by any state as a rule, as binding rule. Non-intervention is the only one that we reach thanks to the Russian and the DNC, because I think that in this case the Americans start to speak about non-intervention, because also non-intervention need some components, very important component to be in order to establish the violation of this rule. For example, the coercive intervention. If it's not coercively, you didn't violate the rule of law. So you have to show that the election campaign was breached by the Russian, and the Russian used coercive actions to influence or to even manipulate or alter the results of the election. Otherwise, they didn't do wrong. And the way forward, we can resume, when I say we, the international community could resume the work of the UN GGE. I'm skeptical, bearing in mind the situation between Russia and the US and China. It's seemed nowadays as a mission impossible. The president of Microsoft came with the initiative of establishing digital Geneva Convention, but it also, from the same reason, look now as a mission impossible. Meanwhile, he succeeded in reaching cybersecurity tech accord between private companies. An international attribution agency, it's a very good idea, but also need agreement or international agreement. Talent-free Lex Ferranda, it's a very good idea, but I'm not sure that Michael Schmidt wants to take it on his shoulder. And I'm not a prophet, but Einstein tried to be, and that's what he said more than 6 years ago.
Thank you so very much. We'll pass directly to Eli Bachar.
Hi. The research we are working on, myself and a friend and a colleague of mine, Mr. Shamir, he's coming from computer science, so he knows exactly how to spell cyber in other terms, not just legal. And we're trying to look at the political interventions that are happening in the last 4 and 5 years, and trying to draw lessons from it and to see what's relevant for the Israel case in order to present recommendations, policy paper for the Israeli apparatus, several apparatuses that deals with cybersecurity and cyber defense. And when it comes to democracy in danger, information manipulation, and election intervention, one can ask himself what's new in that. Because during the last decades, especially from the Cold War era, there were maybe more than 100 identified interventions in other countries' politics. Most of them were launched by the United States. From Iran in the 50s and Chile in the 70s and several countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, wherever. And so this is everything but a new phenomenon intervening in other countries' politics. But during the last 5 years, we see Russia, and thank you for Danny for the list that he drew here. We do see other countries. We see the Chinese, North Korea, Iran as players, but I think Russia is the one huge player that the political intervention and the political meddling in the West, as we used to think about it, is the huge and major threat that imposed today on liberal democracies. And the lessons we draw is especially from the Russian intervention in Europe, Eastern Europe, and the US, of course. And the targets we are focusing at is first their goal to undermine I think the faith of the citizens in democracy and the result of the elections and things like that, and using, I think if we see what's new today, and using new tools like cyber attacks and cyber manipulations. This is what is new basically today at this field. Of course, the Russian meddling in the 2016 American campaign is one of the most investigated events ever, and especially today. But there were also many events in France, in Germany. In Germany, it was, I think, in 1915 manipulation with the Lisa case, and 1916 the Bundestag hacking, and 1917 in Angela Merkel's campaign. So we saw many interventions throughout. Sorry? 2000. What did I say?
100 years ago.
There was British meddling in American elections in 1916. So this is
2000. I'm sorry when I say one. And we saw it on other political phenomenon like the Brexit in Britain, which was in 2016. Thank you. And the Catalan referendum in Spain, and many Eastern European countries like the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Ukraine, of course, and even small countries like Montenegro and Norway, which one can think why there, but anyway, there were many cases of political intervention, and they all used almost the same toolkit, which we want to learn what's going on there. But we do see that meddling in political campaigns became cheaper, became faster, and it allows deniability. I mean, the attribution, what Dan just said about how to attribution is a very important part of how to immune the population from the influence of the whole thing. So the new techniques allow deniability in a very good manner, and this is one of the important characteristics of this kind of warfare. So what are the areas that we are looking at? We look first, I mean, we want to map these activities, techniques, threats, who are the various actors here. It could be intelligence organizations, it could be private hacking groups, it could be sites like WikiLeaks and others, and they are all combined and very and working together in a very unique way. And so these are the challenges that we face. Only, I mean, in the last 3 months we saw reports in the US from the House Subcommittee of Intelligence, which was, I mean, 2 reports, one of the Republican majority and the second of the Democrat minority. We saw the Cambridge Analytica case was exposed, and I mean, many people were shocked about the way that a huge company can micro-targeting millions of people by creating profiles, by exploiting private data, and it's kind of a matrix that is going on there. We do see the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, filed a lawsuit against Russia, against the GRU, against the WikiLeaks, against the Donald Trump campaign. So there are tons of papers are going on, and we are still looking for Robert Mueller's investigation, the Judicial Committee, and many other investigative groups that are dealing with it within the US. So what are the areas that are being targeted when we talk about political influence? First is, of course, the election process per se, meaning it's starting from the electoral roll, I mean the electoral registry, if you manipulate it, if you change it, if you delete it, if you play with it, you can even stop the election process until you fix the whole thing. And then there are countries like the US that they use voting machines, and we all know that voting machines are hackable and therefore insecure. I think last year there was a DEF CON, it calls this hackers meeting in the US, and they put a voting machine in the middle of the room, and then after about 2 to 3 hours the hackers could literally damage this machine or manipulate it or whatever you think. And these are just private hackers, and let alone organized organizations, country sponsored, which have all the time in the world to learn this kind of machines and to do whatever they want. And the last in the voting process is the whole process of the voting tally sheets, when you put it on the computers and trying to count. This is something that we also have to look at because it could be vulnerable for changing and forging. Another important dimension is securing the political players, and by that I mean political parties, and we all know about the hacking to the American Democratic Party and releasing the content, which is emails, which are communications, everything in a critical point at the elections, and influencing the elections, even if you release not a false but a true information that was stolen, as they did in the Democratic Party in the US. But we also look at the parliament members, their aides, and other political players that nobody really understands. There is no formula of who is in charge of defending their stockpiles, their email accounts, or whatever secrets they hold. And secrets could be the campaign strategy, secrets can be the list of supporters of a party. Parties do have their campaign based on things that they want to hold close to them, and therefore manipulation in the parties could be not less effective than direct targeting the voting process. And last but maybe the most important one is the arena of the social media, which is the ground for disinformation, which is the ground of exploiting big data, micro-targeting, as I said, and many other manipulations that are used by bots, as we call it, or artificial accounts, and many other developing tools that are using this arena of free exchange of ideas, accounts, and whatever. The campaigns are trying to amplify the information you want to, to amplify first societal tensions. You can see in Germany, for example, or in France, the tensions between immigrants and the majority, between Islam and others, as we saw in Lisa case in Germany. So this is the arena where undermining democracy, strengthening even the notion of what is true and what is false. This is the place where the warfare is taking place when it comes to social media. So as I said, we would like to draw the various threats to evaluate its potential damages and probabilities, and creating a reference threat, meaning what threats democratic countries should refer to, and trying to defend themselves against this kind of new threats, and trying to predict what will be the next generation in this arena based on artificial intelligence and so forth. The second part of the research deals with the case of Israel. We would like to see what kind of organizations are in charge of defending the political process here, and we are talking with people and looking at the regulation and the whole framework of the law vis-a-vis these kind of manipulations, which are part of it is mere subversion, as we call it, which is part of the Israeli security agency, the Shin Bet, responsibilities. And part of it is just the cyber attacks, which are not just, but cyber attacks which are under the responsibility of the new National Cyber Directorate. And there are other players here, like the Central Elections Committee, who is in charge of the whole election process, and the Knesset, called Masters of Arms, Ktina Knesset, the one who is in charge of the parliament members and their secure accounts, email accounts, and others. So coordinating all these organizations and putting their designing their responsibility and what are the lines between all of these organizations is an important part of our research and our recommendations, of course. And one last thing is that we need to understand that we can take many measures, but the measures must fit our values as liberal democracy, right? We don't want censorship. We would like to our free way of speech in the internet arena will stay like this. We don't want that attribution will cause us calls the big brother to look at who is writing what and where. So keeping our values as free society, as liberal democracy, is something that is essential for all recommendations in this arena, because it's very easy to go to extreme recommendations and extreme policies, and we don't want to get there, because otherwise we won't stay as a liberal democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're going to end that now.
Okay. So, shalom everyone. Thanks to the organizers, for Tal Zharovsky and Dan Stefman for having the courage to entertain the idea that Jewish philosophy is relevant to this conference. So my main focus is autonomous weapon systems, or autonomous weapons, and I'll utilize some insights in Jewish political philosophy in order to contribute to the ethical discussion. Autonomous weapons are mechanisms that have the technical capacity, by means of artificial intelligence, AI, to identify enemy targets and to harm or destroy them without human involvement or supervision. So a drone is not a really full autonomous weapon until it is not human operated at all. My argument is that questions about technology in general and about autonomous weapons and killer robots as such are ultimately about our humanity on the worthy society and democracy. And I think that besides as a technical issues and the laws, the best shield that we have for ourselves and for our children is our common sense, consensual humanity. Once this is broken, and I'll turn to it shortly, there are reasons to be afraid or to be concerned. So this paper has 4 parts. First, I will provide some general background. Second, I'll shortly present the ethical framework underlying this talk. I think it's relevant. Third, following Moshe Halbertal and Stephen Holmes's recent work on the biblical book of Samuel and power and politics in this book, I will raise some ethical questions about autonomous weapons, and maybe the reason that I come from somehow outside the discipline will allow me to raise some radical, maybe, questions about the new possibilities that are becoming available. So, okay. So in some sense, there's nothing new about autonomous weapons, from the primitive bow and arrow or sword. Modern warfare includes land and naval mines, hand grenades, cannons, bombs. All are somehow autonomic or autonomous, but some artificial intelligence-based inventions are indeed new and pose new ethical problems that we deal when we are speaking about autonomous weapons, killer robots of various kinds that you've seen before. And the real advancement is the ability to reach out and to kill anyone, everywhere, without almost any technical limitations. So this should be a problem. And there is a wide discourse over ethics of AI in general. And this book, for example, by Wendell Wallach and Colin Allen, autonomous moral machines assumes that you may, and it is maybe desirable to produce some kind of autonomous moral agent, but it is a question whether it is a good idea, whether you can really achieve such a technological autonomous stage, and whether, even if it is achievable, whether it is a good idea to apply it, and in which cases. So throughout history, I'm also trying to suggest that religion and traditional ideas are relevant for the discussion. And if you will recall my remark about the consensual humanity or shared values, this may be an important contribution, also maybe to narrow the gap between East and West and religions, many religions that we have in the world. So in Jewish tradition, we have the idea of killing as just a sin, and killing of a murderer, even murderer, should be performed by human beings. And of course, we have the Decalogue as a prohibition of murder, and therefore it is very surprising that we don't hear, in the Jewish case, rabbis so much concerned about these topics, although we have some worldwide campaigns, serious campaigns, against autonomous weapons, against the idea that an armed race will just perform a war, seemingly without any costs, but we'll get later to some possible problems about that. For example, the Future of Life Institute, over 20,000 artificial intelligence to robot ethics are signed there. And it is quite surprising to see that the startup nation, so-called, Israel is not taking a big part of it. And I'm more asking about the Jewish side of the startup nation, meaning the Jewish values is what I'm trying to put into the center. So I was very much moved by this exhibition in the Whitney Museum. That actually compares the Mossad with the Gestapo in a kind of pacifist way, saying that killing is killing is killing. I personally disagree with that. Also, I was not in any chief commanding position. I was a tank commander. But from my narrow perspective, I was very moved by that. And I think that's a basic feature that makes an army into a just army. This is something that Israelis really care about with regard to the IDF, is whether it has limitations. So the IDF, of course, is adhering to an ethical code and to a principle of the purity of weapon, Torah Neshek, and following Shai Held, American thinker, I think that there are mainly two lessons from the Holocaust. First, we Jews should have power in their hands, but second, and not least important, this power should be submitted to ethical standards and constant critique, and this is something that one may be concerned if it gets somehow eroded in contemporary Israel. So the IDF, it's not a secret, it was published in newspapers. Some commanders, chief commanders are talking about basically autonomous weapons and more broadly about the preferability of using robots, which is maybe surprising if we call the value of gvura, of courage and self-endangering, that was the basis for the legitimacy to kill human enemies. And therefore, the question about the Jewish people is also a question about the Jewish or the Israeli armies. The Jews are, of course, taking a major part. So let's say a few words about the military ethics of autonomous weapons. And this is a narrower field, compared to the ethics of AI. And there are conventions, former speakers know much more than I about the laws and the legal issues. And the question is basically whether autonomous weapons, fully autonomous weapons, human-like robots or drones, nanorobots, I don't know, should join the club that chemical, biological, atomic weapons are in, because we tend to forget, for reasons I'll turn to soon, that AI is also technology. And we know that former questions were addressed with legal tools and bioethical committees, etc. Yes. Okay. So my interest is ethical, but I think that the legal and the ethical ultimately overlap. And of course, there are questions about the distance between the military and the civilian. This robot dog will be able to carry weapons. In the United States, you can buy weapons. You don't need to have a license. It's a more severe question for them. But even in Israel, where one should have a license, it is a vital question to ask about the limits of the use of weapons in general and autonomous weapons in particular. So the ethical context of my talk is, of course, part of the discourse about war. So we have the use ad bellum and use in bello. Obviously, this is part of the second component that Michael Waltzer's book is famously emphasizing. But we're not talking about the consequence or about the worthy military target, but more about the production of the act of military violence. And this is an important change. It's some kind, turns virtue ethics into the story, because the question is whether such an autonomous robot, a drone, is really morally legitimized, should be legitimized to perform such attacks. So I just want to point out three assumptions that are important for my talk and that are not at all for granted when you see discourses of AI ethics. First of all, the dialogical, relational character of ethics. In holding this, I'm some kind of a feminist, maybe, but I'm following some masculine thinkers like Martin Buber, Hilary Putnam, Stephen Dowell, that are speaking about the importance of relationships. And this is not at all for granted when you think about the Cartesian model of the self as kind of an island that just works towards the world. And this is very important because people are projecting the initial ethical model for the robots. And then we don't have time to talk about that, but this is making, I think, into causing some fallacies. Second, I don't think that technology in general or specific technologies in particular are neutral in the sense that many people are convinced. In this, I follow Jacques Ellul, Neil Postman, Sherry Turkle, and many others. And this is important because I think some of the blindness with regard to technology and to autonomous weapons maybe is connected to some assumptions that will be set forward soon, that the sword may devour, the sword devours, and that it is somehow sui generis, it works by itself, but I'm not sure that this is correct. The third assumption is related to the Weltanschauung, the worldviews that we hold, and we all, religious and secular, hold some kind of idea of disenchanted world. But when it comes to technology, one might think that this is not exactly the case, and we have this new book by Yuval Noah Harari talking about dataism, the data religion, the worship of data and of intelligence, artificial intelligence. And if we want to be critical about ourselves, I think it's important to be aware for a certain blindness that is associated with the discourse of technology. And this may bring to some blindness about the critique of technology, because if technology is deified, obviously our ability to criticize and to come to legal ideas and conclusions or just social contracts is diminished. So the ethics of autonomous weapons are roughly two camps. One is supporting, one is against. The main problems were speaked out before, and we want this technology to be accountable, but it's of course very problematic, and when it comes to the smoky world of war, it is more problematic, and therefore I want to suggest that some ideas from Jewish tradition, and there are more ideas than one I will present now, may enrich the discussion, and I think it's important for every religion and culture to connect in some way, in a Gadamerian way, to connect the horizons between past and present, because otherwise the future might be in higher risk. So again, the question about robots is a question about humans. If you think that mind is computable, you can exhaust what is human, what is thinking, and therefore you may hold that ethics is computable, and I personally disagree. I follow many in that, but it's important to note it, because the supporters of AI often are ignoring these problems. So the contribution of Jewish tradition, one of the possible contributions is the sensitivities that we find in the book of Samuel, and I brought this book of Moshe Albertal and Stephen Holmes, and in one of the chapters they are talking about two crimes that are described. The first is the killing of the priests of Nob by Doeg Edomi. King Saul is asking his milieu to kill the priests of Nob. They are refusing, and he's turning to Doeg Edomi, which is a foreigner, and he is doing the job, and this is making explicit why the ability to refuse or conscientious objection is so important, because in the political game, what the ruler needs more than anything else is the willingness of his subjects to perform what they need to do. Otherwise, it's not a command, and in the case of artificial intelligence, it is a kind of tension, because you want ethics to be, or you want the autonomous weapon, or the weapon, to be programmed, but it's not clear how you can have this component of conscientious objection computable. You want it to be predicted. So this is a very big problem that one should address, and the importance of prohibitional laws in halacha, in Jewish law, is also important concept that Hans Jonas was emphasizing specifically and precisely for the modern humans, that we have endless opportunities, and precisely because of that we maybe should put more attention to what our limits are, which command we would refuse. I don't know, just imaginary, to shoot unarmed protesters, or I'll take something imaginable. So we have a problem about programming it. Second case, really briefly, is David and the killing of Uriah. This is putting forward the very term of the sword devours. And what we see there is that David is actually using a hidden chain of causes in order to kill Uriah because of David's other sin of adultery with Bathsheba. And the problem of agency is here more similar to that of the autonomous weapons because, first of all, the Bible is using this term, the sword devours, as if the sword is having a life of itself. Second of all, because it is really kind of a mechanism of political violence performed by the use of this hidden chain. So I want to end up by suggesting some non-fictional questions, because the question is about sovereignty and about the political arrangement. More and more positions and jobs and responsibilities could be technically performed by robots. Actually, in 5 years, it will be probably possible to produce robots. It will be a almost perfect duplication of each one of us. This is already happening in the case of sex robots. There it's very obvious that this is the idea of duplicating humans. If you are listening to the news, you just have Google duplex. The voice, human voice, and human cognition, human thought is the question of fake humans will become, real fake humans will become very serious in the years to come. And the question about the IDF is ultimately the question, I think, about the Tzva Am, the army of the people, because the army of the people is first performed or carried out by humans, by members of the people. Second, it is serving specific human group. And third, it is accountable. And I think those three aspects are in some shade or in certain risk. And there may be connection, because once the army is not carried out by humans, the component of conscientious objection is really reduced. The question about what kind of democracy will prevail once the ruler is holding some kind of robotic militia, and accountability is the most obvious problem. So I wanted to suggest the vitality of ethical sensibilities in Jewish tradition for encountering this topic of autonomous weapons. Thank you.
He's going to stand.
So I have a few caveats before I'll start talking. First of all, this is a work in progress. I only started to work on it, so I don't have a lot of promises about giving answers to the questions that I'm going to raise. Second caveat is that this does not apply solely to terror. This research is not about terror per se, but there are a lot of different implications, and I'll talk a little bit about them within the talk, which do apply to terror, and we'll see the different ramifications of it. Then there are other caveats that I'll just move through because I don't have a lot of time, and we do not want to have some Q&As. So this is a story about eavesdropping at the beginning. So technology was always, or could have been used by a lot of people to just basically hear something, use the naked ear with that simple technology maybe to know what other people are doing. But when technology evolved, we started seeing the engagement of the state. So we started with mailing telegraphs. And this is very US-based research, just as an example of how it could be applicable to other jurisdictions as well, but I will use that as
wiretapping device.
That's wiretapping device. But we'll see more sophisticated than that. Anyhow, so you can see in the beginning of the 19th century the use of these telegraphs and mail and the use of the government to try to actually obtain communication. This is one form of eavesdropping and tapping as well. It wasn't until the invention of the telephone, which was very innovative at that time, roughly 1890, this was started to be in general use by federal agencies in the US. They sought to bring communication, and we know how it works. The technology behind it could be just tapping the wire outside of the house, maybe placing a bug within a house, and usually they would have worked with telecommunication carriers and just plug into the main system. It was still legal back then on the federal level. On the state level, a lot of different states started to pass their own wiretapping statutes. They applied differently in every state. And there was no federal statute who governed wiretapping. It was permissible back then. The question was, and it came to the Supreme Court in 1928 later, was how much does the Fourth Amendment apply? So the Fourth Amendment would protect or secure people in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. So it could be persons and houses, and it could be effect as the telephone device itself against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now the question that the Supreme Court asked itself is, how much does it extend? This is privacy one-on-one in the US. So Roy Olmsted here he was a bootlegger for liquor during the time of Prohibition in the United States. And he was wiretapped by the government, and they found out the terrible things that he's doing. And then he challenged it to the Supreme Court, saying, this is a violation of my Fourth Amendment. The court said, no, it's not, because it doesn't extend. Wiretapping doesn't extend to the Fourth Amendment. So this was later reversed here in 1967 in the famous Katz case. So Charles Katz was conducting illegal gambling through a public phone booth, and the FBI placed a bug outside of the telephone booth so they could overhear everything that Mr. Katz is saying. In this case, this is one of the most famous cases in privacy because the Supreme Court has finally had some sort of a reasonable expectation of privacy test, which was evolved throughout time, during which there was one federal act which actually dealt with wiretapping. It was from 1934, but court later interpreted it as not applying for actually doing the wiretap, but simply they cannot use the wiretap they obtained in court proceeding. It couldn't be held as evidence in court. That's it, but they could do wiretapping. So after Katz, after we know that the Fourth Amendment applies, Congress has enacted the wiretap statute, which is from 1968. This was the first time which we saw how the application of the Fourth Amendment and how people are protected. So wiretapping is allowed to some extent. If you want to conduct wiretapping, you have to go through a court. You have to get a warrant or a super warrant, as they call it, and we'll talk about the implications of that. So this is the terrorist part. So FISA is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act from 1978. There's a lot of history in between those years. Part of it would be how to regulate when we know that the Fourth Amendment applies. How do we regulate foreign agents who act within the US and do have a constitutional protection like Americans who act for foreign agents? So at the beginning, this was, we can say, highly restrictive of what can Americans do for foreign powers. It initiated what is called a FISA court, when you have a special court who can grant those orders, and we all learned about it from Snowden revelations. And it was later amended and much broadened through what is known as the Patriot Act from 2001, just after 9/11. If you've heard about this famous 2015 section, which expired but then renewed later. And later, and this is really has to do a lot with the work that I'm doing, a section which is called 702 from 2008, the FISA Amendment Act, which basically grants the government a way to bypass a lot of different challenges when it has to do with terrorism. I'll get to that in a second. So going back to wiretapping for regular law enforcement. So in 1986, Congress acknowledged for the first time that wiretapping is not just about phones. There are a lot of different types of information which is gathered. So for what is called the Electronic Communication Privacy Act, they have legislated 3 different acts. The first was the Wiretap Act with a few amendments. But then we have the Stored Communication Act. So what happens when information is stored somewhere in a location? It started the use of computers. That was a huge part of it. And the last act doesn't have to do a lot with my research, is the Pen Register Act, which deals with devices that collect phone numbers mainly. So then the internet came. And when the internet came, there were a lot of questions about
this is a new form of communication, and there's a lot of way to gather data, and we need to have, if we are gonna issue a warrant, let's say we have all the legal rules behind it, we are gonna issue a warrant, we need to know that internet service providers could comply with us, right? So 1994, they enact CALEA, which applies to telecommunication carriers, which operate online, and they must have adjustments for when a warrant will be served, they would be able to actually grant access to communication. It was later also amended in 2004, but for voice over IP, but it's not very, very important. So two famous cases before I get to the normative part. So this is from 2001. Danny Kalo was allegedly growing weed in his house, so the police used thermal devices outside of the house just to see if there are any hotspots within the house, because he might be growing weed. In this very famous case, Danny Kalo was actually won because they couldn't have used that without a warrant, even if it's outside of a house. It's a very famous Scalia discussion on whether or not we can use devices which are in use by the general public or not. So if it's not by using the general public, the police couldn't do it, and we can think about the implications of that. We'll talk about a little bit later regarding the internet today. Another famous case, 6 years ago now, 2012, a guy named Antoine Jones was also allegedly working with narcotics. There was a warrant for this GPS tracker, which was tracked on his car, was placed on his car. There was a warrant, but they exceeded it both by geography of the warrant and by length. And once again, here the Supreme Court said that it was a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So one of the things that we haven't talked about in between was a doctrine, a very important doctrine about privacy and about sharing of information, which evolved over time, starting in 1976, but mainly in 1979, which is something which is called the third-party doctrine. So the third-party doctrine, in general, means that if you voluntarily convey information to a third party, then you have no reasonable expectation of privacy in that information anymore. Talking about the internet, if you conveyed information to Google voluntarily, then Google can transfer it to the government even without a warrant, especially when we're talking about specific issues, as I'll mention in a second. So, why is this so important? What interests me? I'm working on the Internet of Things now, mainly, and something which I call the always-on society and the always-on era. So we're entering an era which is not science fiction anymore. Everything becomes connected, and everything starts sharing data with each other. So everything is a computer, and if it's not, it's gonna be a computer, and the computer's gonna talk. We're gonna have smart everything. This is now becoming more and more common. The smart refrigerator, the smart car, the smart watch, the smart everything. And there are a lot of risks there. So this is gonna be only one facet of it, which I'm gonna talk about. And I'm going to talk about the devices like this. Do you know what this is? How is it called?
Alexa.
Alexa. So everyone says Alexa. Of course, this is the Echo family. A long time it started to be called the Alexa family, the Alexa Echo family. Alexa is the trigger phrase, the main trigger phrase that Amazon uses for these products. You can see many of them. There are various types of products here. So this is the general Alexa, or just a speaker, a smart personal assistant you can talk to. It can answer questions. It can do much more. It can do much more, especially if you live in a state like the United States. You can order food. You can order whatever you want. It would read your emails. It could do basically almost anything that under its capabilities. On the back, we have Amazon Show and Amazon Look here, which have a camera. And we'll talk about the implications of that. So this is just like talking with another Amazon Echo device, which has that same capabilities. In the kitchen, you can just see the picture and talk with your friends. Some of them might have sensors, tell you the temperature, etc., etc. This is just, I'm not going against Amazon or for Amazon. It's just a good example of something that goes in the market. And why is it so important? This is James Bates. So James Bates, a year and a half ago, was a defendant in a very famous murder trial. So the allegations were like this. He spent the night with two friends in his hot tub in his apartment while drinking. There was a football match, they had fun, and in the morning one of them was found dead in the hot tub. Now, police started to investigate and they want to know what happened. First of all, and that's the first use of the Internet of Things here, they approached the water meter company and they discovered that he used about 300 gallons of water during specific times of the day. So he said, I filled up the jacuzzi, the hot tub, right? They said, the police said, you might have washed evidence with it. You might have washed the body, you might have tried to tamper with evidence. It wasn't enough. The second part of the Internet of Things here was that neighbors overheard music playing that night. So when they overheard music, the police saw that he has an Amazon Echo and Alexa. So probably Alexa was playing that night. They got a warrant for Amazon to bring anything that Alexa has captured in the last 24 or 48 hours. They wanted to know, maybe it overheard something. Amazon rejected. They said that this was the warrant. They will comply generally, but not with such a warrant. It is overbroad. It has to be more specific. There are a lot of problems with this warrant, and that raised an issue. That raises an issue about whether these warrants, the search warrants, the wiretapping warrants, are still applicable and should be changed. Unfortunately, for me at least, not for him, Amazon basically, I wanted to have a verdict here. I couldn't because James Bates agreed, consented to the release of information, and they didn't find anything. He was acquitted later on, but we didn't have anything which I at least could use theoretically. But a lot of things happen. Why is it so important? So these things have been hacked. Anything could be hacked. Any computer could be hacked in the world, that's for sure, even with the top cybersecurity measures and standards. But and it's not easy to hack an Amazon Echo, but it's still possible. But they raise a lot of questions of cybersecurity. One of them was just happened 2 weeks ago, when two people had a private conversation in their house, and then one of their friends called them and said, I'm hearing you and your wife right now. So what happened there? Amazon has a lot of explanations. Alexa was allegedly triggered. Someone said Alexa in the fight or conversation between the couples, and then they said the contact name of that person, and then they said send. I'm not sure. But it does raise the question of having those devices collecting so much data. It's just like having a microphone in your house. And it's just not just a microphone. There are video cameras, there are sensors. There are things that monitor your heartbeat, your heart rate, your blood pressure constantly. So the normative question that I'm asking in between is, can we get a warrant for your Fitbit right now if you pass all the current regulations? So if I look at the law right now, these super warrants, there are super warrants because warrants for search are easier to get. If we look at the different types of requirements, for now I can say that I acknowledge that at least requirement 3 and 5 might need modification in the age of the Internet of Things. Why? Because we need to have specific target and location of interception. So usually in the old world, we would have bugged someone's house. So it wouldn't be even the phone. It would be federal agents who come and place a microphone somewhere. But still then, research shows that most of the time it would be confined. The judge would say, okay, you can place that in the living room, but not in the bedroom, because there is higher probability that we might capture some information which is irrelevant but highly sensitive. So we need to take into account that these devices are on us all the time, some of them. Some of them are placed in very highly sensitive areas in the house. And these are just examples. The fifth one, the procedures to minimize interception of irrelevant communication. If you wiretap Alexa and you operate it in your house right now with a household of 5 people in the family, that might be problematic for getting any conversation which is made inside your house, not including guests, etc. So there's a lot of talk always about privacy, and that's a big topic. Privacy or liberty or autonomy, you can replace that, and national security and personal security. So we have all this legislation. There's nothing new about that, but there is something new about how these technologies advance these days. And they do change the notion of how we might view what is called a public-private partnership. Now, this might change now because the US Supreme Court is just handling a case which is called Carpenter this month, and they're going to decide, I think, whether or not to revoke the so-called third-party doctrine. So think of the third-party doctrine which I mentioned before. If Amazon gathers all your information all the time, they can bypass any legal challenges for warrants to transfer it to the government if they decide to do so. There are a lot of different players here, but as long as we have a public-private partnership, there might be legal boundaries which could be surpassed easily. Think of another thing regarding wiretapping of things. So let's say that Kalea, that law which enables communication or obliges telecommunication carriers to have their technology set for a wiretap when it arrives, then we might need to do that for all devices. So any device will have to be able to be wiretapped when a federal agency gets a specific warrant. That would impact the security of things highly. If everything has a backdoor, if everything could be hacked, if everything could be, accessed lawfully, it might be accessed unlawfully much easier, not just by your state, by other states, by other actors, and that would mean downgrading the systems. This is basically the thing that Apple has argued through the Apple FBI famous case. And we have things that have changed. It's data storage. It's much easier and it's much cheaper to store infinite amounts of data now. And it will become much and much easier and cheaper with time, meaning that we don't even need to wiretap everything. Only what we need to do is get a search warrant for something which was just taped 2 seconds ago. And it's much easier to get. We didn't used to have that because you couldn't record all telephone conversation in 1919, for example. So those things, I think, should make us worry a little bit and think about what are the broader implications in the different sensors and the different data that is gathered, and should we have federal agencies, the state, or anyone for that matter, access our things that are in our house and are connected to the internet with sound. They can listen all the time, but there are things who can also watch us all the time. It's not only these, it's your computers as well, and it's your smart TV, and it's everything that has a camera. And when we'll drive an autonomous car, or a smart car even, they will be equipped with sensors and infinite data about what happens not only to you, but to everyone else in your vicinity. Not just the GPS location, that's easy, you have your phones with you all the time. It will have everything that happens in the car and everything that you have done because it will be synchronized with data from your life. And it will be living in a smart city, which everything is connected all the time, the data is gathered all the time, and there was an alleged incident, at least for 2 weeks ago, starting to talk about the Amazon facial recognition program embedded within, allegedly, smart cities like Chicago, meaning that all these streets are watched over all the time with cameras, just without wiretap, without any types of subpoenas, without any court or judicial intervention, just technology combined with a public-private partnership and smart cities, which we will maybe all like to live in. It will make our life easier, but it will mean giving up a lot of things. So this is a few thoughts, food for thought, and 3-4 months from now, hopefully I'll have the answers as well. So Internet of Things, I think that at least in this aspect, we have to start rethinking many of the things that we have started using, like search. What is the meaning of searching in the age when everything is stored and everything is recording all the time? What is reasonable expectation of privacy anymore? If we live in a smart city, does that mean that we don't have any reasonable expectation of privacy anymore and that's it? If you have an Alexa, that's it, privacy is dead, like the famous Scott McNeely argument that we have zero privacy anyway, so let's just get over it? Or is it more important now because of these technologies? We need to redefine and rethink what is stored communication and what is wiretapping, because the time that these concepts were conceived was 1986 or 1890. And things have changed a little bit since then. And it's not just a wiretapping per se. It could be searched very quickly. And maybe we should think about new other values. Like we always say, like we should not legislate things that depend on technology, but rather legislate neutral laws. But they have to embed the values that we are trying to seek. And those values might be different today because of the different changes that technology brings upon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adele. That was fascinating. So I think I'll just first check if anyone has a burning question on their mind to any of the speakers. So please feel free to raise your hands. And Professor Euter.
So, I can also talk. I have a question, I have a remark and a question to I have a remark and question to Dan Efroni. You mentioned the principle of non-intervention as one of the stepping stones in dealing with that from a perspective of international law. But my impression is if you go more in detail, let's say we realize that it's a kind of blind spot in international law. We have this idea of the principle of non-intervention, but we don't know that much what it means in detail. And I think if you look in the Tallinn manual, in the parts of that, you make a bit the same experience, and you also realize that there's a lot of compromise formula in the Tallinn manual in these parts, because it's obvious the US officials are very ambivalent on that because they have so much. One of the leaders in the also offensive cyber capacities, they don't want to be too precise in further developing the law because that would hinder their operations. And so I think it was obviously behind the lines that there were a lot of difficulties of becoming concrete in the Tallinn expert group on these issues. So do you share this kind of this impression?
Totally share this impression, and I said that it's ambiguity. It's typical, specifically in this field of cyberspace. We have it isn't a new phenomenon in international law. But dealing with cyberspace, it's all over the picture of trying to, if you accept it as it is now, you accept a situation that you will not reach any clear law that will bind other nations, and also I understand, I came from my background in the intelligence in the beginning, so I understand about the capabilities that the US, Israel, and UK and others want to keep, and they know that if they move ahead with clarifying their law, or as they perceive it, it's immediately bind them because they are coming from democracies. What every rule that they will support or publish their legal stance would oblige them, first of all, not the Chinese, not the Russian, not the North Korean. So they are, and they know other things, that there are other reasons for this ambiguity, but the one that you said, I know. But still, I think that we, and the time is not, I believe that the speech of the UK Attorney General 2 weeks ago was the first signal. I'm sure that will, in the coming months, will hear from the American and others, because other way the international community can't face this situation. Those critic threat that was expanded my colleague, you have to regulate it.
So just one short. I completely agree. It was not meant in supporting the US position on that. I think small and medium-scale European states will have a completely different optic on that and perspective on that. And I think it's our task as international lawyers to develop a perspective on that. We need rules, and we shouldn't give in to this perspective of the UK Attorney General.
And I think that Germany too, you have something that we be happy to speak with you later on about. You have a proposal to new bill about hacking back. It's also kind of self-ed that now is forbidden, but it's very interesting to know what would be the German position, lawmaker would be.
I see already two other hands, but I'd like to read and use my chair's privilege and ask a follow-up question on this particular discussion, which is, how do you understand the UK's position on this issue? What does it mean not to accept sovereignty as a rule, but to accept it as a principle, and how, in terms of the practical consequences, not in terms of the high theory doctrine, but in terms of what it means in reality? And a second part of that is, what is, as far as we know, what is our own country's position on this issue right now?
The Israeli position is ambiguous as their counterpart in the UK. Sovereignty, I don't know what is the official position of the Israeli, we can't say government, but it's the legal advisors. But what is the practical meaning of this position, American and British position, is that they can go on with so-called violating the rule of sovereignty on daily basis, and there are, as I mentioned before, they are not alone in this arena, and without being held as accountable to those acts. And they, not everything, our research based on open source information, most or the majority are covered. And the Americans don't want to feel that they are wrongdoers, even by cover adoption. By cover, I believe so. It's not true, but I don't want to speak on behalf of the American. But as an Israeli, I don't want, and I was a legal advisor, and I don't want to give legal advice knowing that it is violation of international law on daily basis. And I think that by embracing the sovereignty as a principle, they give them a very room and expand room of freedom of action.
Eli?
Yes, thank you very much for this enlightening presentations. I want to remind you that our session, our workshop is about terror, and most of you actually talk about warfare, except Eldar, who actually talked about counter-terror mechanism. In Eldar's word, counter-terrorism is very efficient because we will be able to know everything about anybody. But I want to ask you specifically, but also other panelists, about shifting your discourse from cyber warfare to cyber terrorism. Okay? Because many of the things that you talked about, meddling with elections results, can be classified as terror activities. Terror activities are criminal offenses that are conducted for either throwing fear or changing political decision-making. So maybe the problem here is not really international law regarding the laws of war, but criminal international law regarding terrorism. And I want to invite you to change the topic, change a little bit your presentation, not to talk about Tallinn vis-a-vis warfare, but Tallinn vis-a-vis terrorism or international terrorism, and how to combat terrorism conducted with cyber means or through cyber. So some of the, from your big table, some of the incidents are not terrorism. If it's data hacking.
But they could be.
No. If we look at the narrow definition of terror, just extracting information, secrets, is not terrorism. Okay? Terrorism is where you actually want to either extract fear or change political decision-making. Meddling with elections, okay, is terrorism, or hurting infrastructure through cyber means is terrorism.
No.
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 No?
No.
What I mean, if you destroy whole systems of
if you destroy, but if you destroy,
but not just manipulate information.
No, manipulating information is not. But if you want, if your mean is to destroy infrastructure through computers, this is terrorism. And maybe the real interesting exercise will shift from is shifting from this discourse of the law of warfare or international law of war to actually terrorism as its core definition, and what are the impact of the new technologies on maybe creating new offenses, okay, or international offenses that we consider, if they are conducted for the purpose of fear or changing political decisions making, and how to do that and not change the law of war.
I started my presentation explaining that I'm not going to focus on terror, cyber terror, because I see the cyber terror as part of this law of warfare. Because if you read the incident that we checked, the Iranian cases or the Saudi cases, it's totally terror. You don't know that it's Iran behind it, but it could be. By the way, most of the incidents are supposed to be executed by organization, by groups of hackers. So change the national. Some of them, for example, in the Bundestag, that was the official position of the German government or security authorities. It was acted Russian hackers, not by the government. So those hackers are terrorists. If Hamas hack the Knesset now, stealing or trying to usurp using the language of Helen Manuel, usurp the governmental actions of the Knesset. It's terror activity. It's not only
it's not terror activity according to Israeli law. Terrorism in Israeli law is defined as a criminal offense that has a special intent. And hacking or extracting information.
It's not by coincidence. It's not coincidence. Hacking is with intent.
A special intent not a special intent to extract information, but a special intent to either extract fear or to manipulate decision-making of official bodies. So hacking is not a terror activity.
Take the OPM, for example. OPM, it's stealing of 20 million files of security, including all the agents of the CIA and the FBI all over the world. And if it was hacked by a group of terror, isn't it a terror?
If they use it afterwards for action.
No, you have not. What you suggest that we have to stay and see what they are going to do with it. If it was, are going to visit Israel. Because if Hamas now steal all the details of the Mossad, the Israeli Mossad, and they can attack them now, it's part of the terror activity.
Okay, the Israeli government extracted all the documents of the Iranian. This is terror activity?
No, it's state by state.
State cannot extract terror means?
North Korea, North Korea, for example, they used it when they threatened the American, the Sonia, they used the words terror. But they sent a letter to the UN saying that they will consider the American movie as an act of war. But they actually, the American administration didn't treat it as a terror. The American president was asked and he said it's act of vandalism. It's not terror, but it's not act of war, it's vandalism. It's kind of ambiguity.
We are already 5 minutes behind schedule. Let me take 2 questions to the panel. Okay.
I want to enhance what was said before. It's terror
organization is a mercenary of a government, for instance. So we are coming to the point that the state has conducted a terror offense. So this is the ambiguity that we have with terror.
Okay. Is there anyone else before we finish?
I just want to point out in terms of Val's presentation that the warrant requirement is one element of meeting the warrant requirement is one way to be within the confines of the Fourth Amendment, but there's a special doctrine, such as the special needs doctrine in Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. And when we shift to emergency, times of emergency, there are abilities to act even without warrants. And this was also applied in schools for testing children walking in with drugs, right? So we need to remember that we're not confined to the Fourth Amendment on the one hand. On the other hand, the point that saying that if Google receives information, it's not subject to the Fourth Amendment, it also isn't true because cats always apply.
No, but not on the FISA. Not on the 702 detective order.
The Fourth Amendment applies, but then these are special needs doctrines. Okay, so this goes to the first part. But again, so it depends on what compartment you're in here. So FISA, it's maybe from the outside, you have special needs. You have general warrants, that's one element. The other element you said, kind of third-party doctrine. Google isn't subject because of Smith. So you still have cats, which means that you have reasonable expectations. So for instance, in your email, according to the Warshak case, you have...
The Warshak case is only in one jurisdiction. It's not by the Supreme Court, it's only in one.
But
there are a lot of arguments about email privacy.
It's quite acceptable.
We can talk about it.
Guy Floney and then Val, if you want to.
It's, you asked, you tried to clarify, but I thank you for your comment, because I think that if there is no situation that you say the states did an act of terror against, let's say, Lebanon against Israel, because the relationship between two states, we are within the laws of our conflict. So if Lebanon did something through proxy, through Hezbollah, from the Lebanese territories against Israel, Israel has the right, and it reached or crossed the threshold of use of force and armed attack, they has the right to for self-defense and attack again. So from this point of view, I don't think that there is any importance of defining it as an act of terror of Lebanese against Israel.
Thanks everyone. Lunchtime.
We will convene again at 1:45, and we are invited all for lunch.
Where is lunch?
I think it's here.
Lunch is just here.
No, we were not discussing it in the law of war paradigm. This non-intervention debate is broader.
It's interesting
because it's also
the boundaries between warfare and terror are very. This is one of the problems.
Yeah, no, but I think this non-intervention debate, it's more, let's say, if you have intelligence operations against transnational terrorism, that's really an issue because it's the question: do you, for example, by hacking into the telecommunication system of a third state, may wiretap communications without the authorization of the state concerned, and that's really the non-intervention debate. In that sense, it's relevant.
But the tapping itself is not a terror activity.
No, clearly not.
It can be a preparation.
No.
When you want to do something.